Hi everyone, I hope you're all doing well and you're enjoying this beautiful weather. Today we're going to focus on chapters 24 and 25 of To Kill a Mockingbird, and I really want to hone in on Harper Lee's style, the author style. So if you take a look on your screen, I'm giving you some information. I'm going to work through this sheet with you, and then I would like you to try one on your own. So we left off in chapter 23 with Jem telling his sister Scout that he's beginning to understand why Boo Radley stays inside the house. It's not because anybody is forcing him to, it's because he wants to. And this is a realization that Jem is coming to, which really helps us to hone in on the idea that To Kill a Mockingbird is a coming-of-age story. Both Jem and Scout are developing as the story progresses. And remember that Scout is looking back at this as an adult. So Jem is obviously learning a little faster than his sister Scout, but Scout is also learning that there are lots of things that create a divide in Macomb County. Remember that this is taking place during the 1930s. There's a lot of racial divide, a lot of racial tension, and that racial divide is also allowing Scout and Jem to see that there is a social divide as well, that there are different structures within their county, and they fall under one particular structure, or I guess the level in that structure, and Boo Radley, Tom Robinson, Calpurnia, they all fall in different categories. So we see this even being a huge problem in our country today. So even though this is a fictional text and it's taking place during the 1930s, it's really still a very important and live topic in our nation today, especially now with the death of George Floyd and all of the riots that are going on. You can see how much of a social divide and racism still exist in our country. So we'll talk a little bit about that later on. Take a look at your screen. I have here the focus, the author's style. So I'm going to read you the definition. It says, style is a literary technique used by an author to create a piece of literature that reveals the author's uniqueness. Word choice, figurative language, imagery, rhythm, sentence structure, foreshadowing, symbolism, the use of dialect, and other literary devices all work together to make an author's writing distinctive. Now, don't get caught up or intimidated by all of these different techniques. The author's style you've been practicing for a very long time. For example, we talked about that with Romeo and Juliet, and you see, or we were able to study Shakespeare's style, right? How he uses figurative language and the word choices to create a particular mood or to help us understand Romeo and Juliet. He also uses foreshadowing in his play. If you want an example for the use of dialect, you might think back to middle school in 7th grade when you read The K. Theodore Taylor uses dialect when he created the character of Timothy. And that West Indian dialect really helped you to understand the type of person that Timothy was in relation to where he comes from. And again, there are other different types of literary devices that I'll get into. The style in which an author writes influences how well we, as the reader, understand and identify with the literature, and it reveals an author's biases as well as beliefs. Harper Lee uses natural techniques of style which help to make To Kill a Mockingbird such a literary success. She uses dialogue, and we see that between the conversations that Jem Scout have with Dill and their father Atticus and even Calpurnia. There's also dialect, especially with Tom Robinson, and even when the children went to Calpurnia's church. There's also a conversational tone, and this is primarily whenever Atticus is speaking to Scout, but we also see it with Aunt Alexandra. Allusions, when they allude to things that we might be familiar with. A lot of popular allusions come from the Bible. We can also use very complex vocabulary. And this is famous for Atticus's character because he uses a lot of vocabulary that's prone to be used by attorneys. And then you have different types of figurative language. So these are the different techniques or the different styles that Harper Lee uses. It says, however, depending upon the character, some of these elements may change. For example, Anne Alexandra speaks very differently from Mayella Ewell, and Lee, the author, has been able to truly capture those characters by deliberately varying the tone and vocabulary for each. Her mastery at depicting both of these characters and her ability to weave the story between the two makes her style unique and admirable. And again, this is what makes a classic, which is why we studied To Kill a Mockingbird years after it was written. So what they want us to do is to identify the elements of style that have been used in each of the following excerpts from chapters 24 and 25. These are the chapters we'll be reading. And they want us to choose from the list that there are in the box. It says we can use a dictionary if we need help to identify the meaning of these words. Stylistic elements may be used more than once, and there may be more than one right answer for each. So it says, as you identify the elements of style that have been used, explain the effect that these techniques have on the reader. So the effect is how it causes you to feel or what it allows you to learn about the character. So these are some of the different elements. Figurative language, short, concise sentences, or very long sentences. The use of dialect, imagery or slang, repetition. Maybe they're long and wordy sentences. Maybe she uses flashback, or colloquialisms, which I'll talk to you about in a minute. Sensory images that helps to create an image in your mind. Symbolism. Maybe they use plain and simple vocabulary or dialogue. So these are a few of the examples that we can use. So take a look at the example here at the bottom. It says, from the kitchen, I heard Mrs. Grace Merriweather giving a report in the living room on the squalid lives of the Maroonists. It sounded like to me. Remember, this is Scout talking. They put the women out in huts when their time came, whatever that was. They had no sense of family. I knew that distress auntie. They subjected children to terrible ordeals when they were 13. They were crawling with yaws and earworms. They chewed up and spat out the bark of a tree into a communal pot and then got drunk on it. So let's take a look at the sentences here and see how many we have, or if they're very short or they're very long. From the kitchen, I heard Mrs. Grace Merriweather giving a report. So we have a fairly simple sentence, right? It's not very long. I can see here that I have these dashes. I knew that'd distress auntie. So here we have Scout interjecting, right? This isn't part of what happened, but Scout wants to tell us that she knew this information would really bother her aunt. That's why these are there. So I wrote down here the elements of style. They're very long, wordy, and disconnected sentence in a conversational tone. So long, wordy sentences, right? I have a conversational tone as well, right over here. But it's also including very plain and simple vocabulary, which is the use of colloquialism when their time came. Okay? So these would be 3 examples that I chose from up here to explain the style that Harper Lee used when writing this paragraph. But what does that do? Well, the effect here, the use of these long, wordy, and disconnected sentences in a conversational tone gives this feeling that Scout is repeating, almost word for word, the story of Mrs. Merriweather. Of course, Scout was not able to hear and tell every word, so it was a sort of feeling that she is repeating the part she caught of the story. Sure, that makes sense. Here again, she interjects. So if she's remembering that this would distress auntie, it's a thought that's coming to her mind as she's hearing somebody else speak, she might be missing some of the information that they're giving. So let's take a look at another example. And here, unfortunately, I have it down at the bottom. So I'll leave it here so we can see the different examples that we can choose from, and then I'll type out the answers for us. So take a look. The gentle hum of ladies' voices grew louder as she opened the door. Why, Alexandra, I never saw such Charlotte. Just lovely. I never can get my crust like this. Never can. Who'd have thought of little dewberry tarts? Calpurnia? Who'd have thought it? Anybody tell you that the preacher's wife's no, well, she is, and the other one not walking yet. So there's a lot going on in this paragraph here. So the gentle hum of ladies' voices grew louder as she opened the door. The she would have to be Calpurnia. Calpurnia is coming in from the kitchen. And as she's walking in, she hears one of the ladies say, Why, Alexandra, I never saw such Charlotte. Just lovely, says another. I never can get my crust like this, never can. Who'd have thought of little dewberry tarts? And then they see Calpurnia. Calpurnia? And now Calpurnia answers. Who'd have thought it? Anybody can tell you that the preacher's wife's no, well, she is, and that other one not walking yet. So they ask Calpurnia, and then they continue to speak. So if we go up here, let's see if we can find some examples to help us understand the style that Harper Lee is using. Why, Alexandra, I never saw such Charlotte is part of a conversation. Conversational tone would definitely need to be included in there. You also have these quotes. There's dialogue. Are these sentences very long? No. So we have very plain, simple vocabulary. We can't use long and wordy sentences, but they're short. Anything else? Is there complex vocabulary? No. Imagery? No. So we'll go with plain, simple vocabulary. There's a conversational tone, and we have dialogue. So I can write that down here at the bottom. Okay. So I'll write in here, I can write long. It's not long, it would be plain, simple vocabulary. I also need to write conversational tone. And we also said dialogue. Okay. So now we need to talk about the effect. So what effect does this create? Well, very similar to what we have here at the top, these sentences, the simple vocabulary, the conversational tone, and the use of dialogue helps the reader understand. So let me fix this for us before I continue. That Scout is listening to the conversation between the ladies And the conversation seems to be very normal. So this kind of helps us to understand what Scout is remembering. Let's take a look at one more. Here I have the ladies were cool and fragile pastel prints. Most of them were heavily powdered but unrobed. The only lipstick in the room was Tangy Natural. Kotex Natural sparkled on their fingernails, but some of the younger ladies wore rose. They smelled heavenly. I sat quietly, having conquered my hands by tightly gripping the arms of the chair, and waited for someone to speak to me. So let's just go back to the chart here. Figurative language, short, concise sentences, a stream of consciousness, imagery, slang, formal tone, repetition, symbolism, foreshadowing, dialogue. Let's go back and see what Scout is saying. The ladies were cool and fragile pastel prints. So she's obviously describing what the women are wearing. Most of them were heavily powdered but unrobed. And then she gives us the name of these different lipsticks. Tangy Natural. They also have Codex Natural on their fingernails. Some of the younger ladies wore rose, and they smelled very nice. And she, Scout, sat quietly, having conquered her hands by holding onto the armchairs, just waiting for someone to speak to her. So, the ladies were cool and fragile pastel prints. Helps us really to envision what it is that these women are wearing. So I would say these are sensory images or figurative language. They smelled heavenly would be another example of figurative language or sensory images. We do have plain and simple vocabulary. We don't get any dialogue. And her sentences aren't very long or wordy at all. I would say it's very plain and simple. And they're also very short and concise sentences. I can even stretch it and say that there's imagery. So let's write a few of them down here. We have imagery, figurative language. We have, which one is it? Short and concise sentences. Sorry. Sorry. Okay. So what is the effect that these sentences here create for us? Why do you think Scout talks to us about these fragile pastel prints, that they smelled heavenly, and yet she's tightly holding onto the arms of the chair waiting for someone to speak to her? So the use of imagery to describe what the ladies are wearing. The use of figurative language to describe. Let me bring this over here. To describe how they smell draws a contrast to Scout and what she wears and how she can smell. Remember, what does Scout dress in? So although she's a girl, and we know in the beginning of the story that even Scout was saying, Jem was telling Scout that she was acting too much like a girl. She really doesn't dress like one, and she clashes with her aunt because she's always in overalls. So this really shows a contrast to how Scout is dressed, and it may show how uncomfortable Scout may feel. So that gives you some examples of the author's style. I'm going to give you one more in your assignment for today, and I will leave this up in the assignment in the lesson folder for you to refer to. What I would like us to do is to move into chapter 24 for today. Both chapter 24 and 25 are very short, and you're going to see a lot of these examples that we did on the screen here in the chapter. So let's take a look at this. If you haven't done so already, you need to download chapters 24 and 25. Chapter 24 starts on page 121. It's right here at the bottom. And remember that we said that Scout hears her brother Jem saying that he now is beginning to understand why Boo Radley wants to stay inside. So in this chapter, we're going to see Aunt Alexandra holding a meeting or a small gathering with some of the women from the town. Remember that this is in the wake of the Tom Robinson verdict. So take a look at this with me.
Calpurnia wore her stiffest starched apron. She carried a tray of Charlotte. She backed up to the swinging door and pressed gently. I admired the ease and grace with which she handled heavy loads of dainty things. So did Aunt Alexandra, I guess, because she had let Calpurnia serve today. August was on the brink of September. Dill would be leaving for Meridian tomorrow. Today he was off with Jim at Barker's Eddy. Jim had discovered with angry amazement that nobody had ever bothered to teach Dill how to swim, a skill Jim considered necessary as walking. They had spent 2 afternoons at the creek. They said they were going in naked, and I couldn't come, so I divided the lonely hours between Calpurnia and Miss Maudie. Today, Aunt Alexandra and her missionary circle were fighting the good fight all over the house. From the kitchen, I heard Mrs. Grace Merriweather giving a report in the living room on the squalid lives of the Maroonahs, it sounded like to me. They put the women out in huts when their time came, whatever that was. They had no sense of family. I knew that'd distress Auntie. They subjected children to terrible ordeals when they were 13. They were crawling with yaws and earworms. They chewed up and spat out the bark of a tree into a communal pot and then got drunk on it. Immediately thereafter, the ladies adjourned for refreshments. I didn't know whether to go into the dining room or stay out. Aunt Alexandra told me to join them for refreshments. It was not necessary that I attend the business part of the meeting. She said it bore me. I was wearing my pink Sunday dress, shoes, and a petticoat, and reflected that if I spilled anything, Calpurnia would have to wash my dress again for tomorrow. This had been a busy day for her. I decided to stay out. "Can I help you, Cal?" I asked, wishing to be of some service. Calpurnia paused in the doorway. "You be still as a mouse in that corner," she said, "and you can help me load up the trays when I come back." The gentle hum of ladies' voices grew louder as she opened the door. "Why, Alexandra, I never saw such Charlotte. Just lovely. I never can get my crust like this. Never can. Who'd have thought of little dewberry tarts? Calpurnia, who'd have thought it? Anybody tell you that the preacher's wives—" "No. Well, she is, and that other one not walking yet." They became quiet, and I knew they had all been served. Calpurnia returned and put my mother's heavy silver pitcher on a tray. "This coffee pitcher's a curiosity," she murmured. "They don't make 'em these days. Can I carry it in?" "If you be careful and don't drop it, set it down at the end of the table by Miss Alexandra, down there by the cups and things. She's going to pour." I tried pressing my behind against the door, as Calpurnia had done, but the door didn't budge. Grinning, she held it open for me. "Careful now, it's heavy. Don't look at it and you won't spill it." My journey was successful. Aunt Alexandra smiled brilliantly. "Stay with us, Jean Louise," she said. This was a part of her campaign to teach me to be a lady.
So, again, this is one of the reasons why Alexandra feels that she should be with Atticus for some time. She feels that Scout is growing up and she doesn't have a model woman to learn from. So here, Aunt Alexandra is very happy that Scout isn't outside with the boys, but is trying to take part in the conversation in this gathering that she's having with her friends.
It was customary for every circle hostess to invite her neighbors in for refreshments, be they Baptists or Presbyterians, which accounted for the presence of Miss Rachel, sober as a judge, Miss Maudie, and Miss Stephanie Crawford. Rather nervous, I took a seat beside Miss Maudie and wondered why ladies put on their hats to go across the street. Ladies and bunches always filled me with vague apprehension and a firm desire to be elsewhere, but this feeling was what Aunt Alexandra called being spoiled. The ladies were cool and fragile pastel prints. Most of them were heavily powdered but unrouged. The only lipstick in the room was Tangy Natural. Q-Tex Natural sparkled on their fingernails, but some of the younger ladies wore rose. They smelled heavenly. I sat quietly, having conquered my hands by tightly gripping the arms of the chair, and waited for someone to speak to me. Miss Maudie's gold bridgework twinkled. "You're mighty dressed up, Miss Jean Louise," she said. "Where are your breeches today?" "Under my dress." I hadn't meant to be funny, but the ladies laughed. My cheeks grew hot as I realized my mistake, but Miss Maudie looked gravely down at me. She never laughed at me unless I meant to be funny. In the sudden silence that followed, Miss Stephanie Crawford called from across the room. "What you going to be when you grow up, Jean Louise? A lawyer?" "No, I hadn't thought about it," I answered, grateful that Miss Stephanie was kind enough to change the subject. Hurriedly, I began choosing my vocation: nurse, aviator. "Well, why shoot, I thought you wanted to be a lawyer. You've already commenced going to court." The ladies laughed again. "That's Stephanie's a card," somebody said. Miss Stephanie was encouraged to pursue the subject. "Don't you want to grow up to be a lawyer?" Miss Maudie's hand touched mine, and I answered mildly enough, "No, just a lady." Miss Stephanie eyed me suspiciously, decided that I meant no impertinence, and contented herself with, "Well, you won't get very far until you start wearing dresses more often." Miss Maudie's hand closed tightly on mine, and I said nothing. Its warmth was enough. Mrs. Grace Merriweather sat on my left, and I felt it would be polite to talk to her. Mr. Merriweather, a faithful Methodist under duress, apparently saw nothing personal in singing "Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me." It was the general opinion of Maycomb, however, that Mrs. Merriweather had sobered him up and made a reasonably useful citizen of him. For certainly Mrs. Merriweather was the most devout lady in Maycomb. I searched for a topic of interest to her. "What did you all study this afternoon?" I asked. "Oh, child, those poor Marooners," she said, and was off. Few other questions would be necessary. Mrs. Merriweather's large brown eyes always filled with tears when she considered the oppressed. "Living in that jungle with nobody but J. Grimes Everett," she said. "Not a white person'll go near 'em but that saintly J. Grimes Everett." Mrs. Merriweather played her voice like an organ. Every word she said received its full measure. The poverty, the darkness, the immorality, nobody but J. Grimes Everett knows. "You know, when the church gave me that trip to the campgrounds, J. Grimes Everett said to me, 'Was he there, ma'am?' I thought, 'Home on leave,' J. Grimes Everett said to me. He said, 'Mrs. Merriweather, you have no conception of what we are fighting over there.' That's what he said to me." "Yes, ma'am." "I said to him, 'Mr. Everett,' I said, 'the ladies of the Macomb, Alabama Methodist Episcopal Church South are behind you 100%. That's what I said to him. And you know, right then and there, I made a pledge in my heart. I said to myself, when I go home, I'm going to give a course on the Marooners and bring J. Grimes Everett's message to Macomb. And that's just what I'm doing."
So, talking about style, here you see how Harper Lee, through the use of dialogue, as these different women are speaking, we get to see the mentality, what they think about, even their role within society, and what is deemed acceptable and what isn't. So we saw it with Scout and how she needs to wear a dress in order to look like a woman. And then you have Mrs. Merriweather here talking about how she needs to bring about this message that helps people understand how they're supposed to live.
"Yes, ma'am." When Mrs. Merriweather shook her head, her black curls jiggled. "Jean Louise," she said, "you are a fortunate girl. You live in a Christian home with Christian folks in a Christian town. Out there in J. Grimes Everett's land, there's nothing but sin and squalor." "Yes, ma'am. Sin and squalor. What was that, Gertrude?" Mrs. Merriweather turned on her chimes for the lady sitting beside her. "Oh, that! Well, I always say forgive and forget. Forgive and forget. Thing that church ought to do is help her lead a Christian life for those children from here on out. Some of the men ought to go out there and tell that preacher to encourage her." "Excuse me, Mrs. Merriweather," I interrupted. "Are you all talking about Mayella Ewell?" "May? No, child. That darky's wife. Tom's wife. Tom Robinson, ma'am." Mrs. Merriweather turned back to her neighbor. "There's one thing I truly believe, Gertrude," she continued, "but some people just don't see it my way. If we just let them know we forgive 'em, that we've forgotten it, then this whole thing'll blow over." Mrs. Merriweather," I interrupted once more. "What'll blow over?" Again she turned to me. Mrs. Merriweather was one of those childless adults who find it necessary to assume a different tone of voice when speaking to children. "Nothing, Jean Louise," she said in stately Largo. "The cooks and field hands are just dissatisfied, but they're settling down now. They grumbled all next day after that trial."
So here, without getting into much detail, what these women are saying is that they want Tom Robinson's family, his wife, to know that they're forgiven for that sin that Tom Robinson committed against Mayella Ewell. So these women believe that Tom Robinson is guilty, and they're completely against this idea that Atticus should appeal. Or even completely against the idea that this ever happened, right? They want to allow Tom Robinson's family to know that these women, as Christian women, are forgiving them for their sins. And obviously, Scout is understanding this to a certain extent, but she knows it's not right.
Mrs. Merriweather faced Mrs. Farrow. Gertrude, I tell you there's nothing more distracting than a sulky darky. Their mouths go down to here. Just ruins your day to have one of 'em in the kitchen. You know what I said to my Sophie, Gertrude? I said, Sophie, I said, you simply are not being a Christian today. Jesus Christ never went around grumbling and complaining, and you know it did her good. She took her eyes off that floor and said, no, Miss Merriweather, Jesus never went around grumbling. I tell you, Gertrude, you never ought to let an opportunity go by to witness for the Lord. I was reminded of the ancient little organ in the chapel at Finch's Landing. When I was very small, and if I had been very good during the day, Atticus would let me pump its bellows while he picked out a tune with one finger. The last note would linger as long as there was air to sustain it. Mrs. Merriweather had run out of air, I judged, and was replenishing her supply while Mrs. Farrow composed herself to speak. Mrs. Farrow was a splendidly built woman with pale eyes and narrow feet. She had a fresh, permanent wave, and her hair was a mass of tight gray ringlets. She was the second most devout lady in Maycomb. She had a curious habit of prefacing everything she said with a soft, sibilant sound. Grace, she said, it's just like I was telling Brother Hudson the other day. Brother Hudson, I said, looks like we're fighting a losing battle. A losing battle. I said, it doesn't matter to 'em one bit. We can educate 'em till we're blue in the face. We can try till we drop to make Christians out of 'em, but there's no lady safe in her bed these nights. He said to me, Mrs. Farrow, I don't know what we're coming to down here. I told him that was certainly a fact. Mrs. Merriweather nodded wisely. Her voice soared over the clink of coffee cups and the soft bovine sounds of the ladies munching their dainties. Gertrude, she said, I tell you there are some good but misguided people in this town. Good but misguided. Folks in this town who think they're doing right, I mean. Now far be it from me to say who, but some of 'em in this town thought they were doing the right thing a while back, but all they did was stir 'em up. That's all they did. Might have looked like the right thing to do at the time. I'm sure I don't know. I'm not read in that field, but sulky, dissatisfied. I tell you, if my Sophie'd kept it up another day, I'd have let her go. It's never entered that wool of hers that the only reason I keep her is because this depression's on, and she needs her $1.25 every week she can get it. His food doesn't stick going down, does it?
So here, Sophie is the housekeeper. So in essence, that is the, I guess, the almost like Calpurnia is for Atticus and his family. So these women don't believe that these people, the ones that work for these families, should have ever believed that Tom Robinson was innocent of the crime.
Maudie said it. Two tight lines had appeared in the corners of her mouth. She had been sitting silently beside me, her coffee cup balanced on one knee. I had lost the thread of conversation long ago when they quit talking about Tom Robinson's wife and had contented myself with thinking of Finch's Landing and the river. Aunt Alexandra had got it backwards. The business part of the meeting was blood-curdling. The social hour was dreary. "Maudie, I'm sure I don't know what you mean," said Mrs. Merriweather. "I'm sure you do," Miss Maudie said shortly. She said no more. When Miss Maudie was angry, her brevity was icy. Something had made her deeply angry, and her gray eyes were as cold as her voice. Mrs. Merriweather reddened, glanced at me, and looked away. I could not see Mrs. Farrow. Aunt Alexandra got up from the table and swiftly passed more refreshments, neatly engaging Mrs. Merriweather and Mrs. Gates in brisk conversation. When she had them well on the road with Mrs. Perkins, Aunt Alexandra stepped back. She gave Miss Maudie a look of pure gratitude, and I wondered at the world of women. Miss Maudie and Aunt Alexandra had never been especially close, and here was Auntie silently thanking her for something. For what, I knew not. I was content to learn that Aunt Alexandra could be pierced sufficiently to feel gratitude for help given. There was no doubt about it. I must soon enter this world, where on its surface fragrant ladies rocked slowly, fanned gently, and drank cool water. But I was more at home in my father's world. People like Mr. Hecate did not trap you with innocent questions to make fun of you. Even Jim was not highly critical unless you said something stupid. Ladies seemed to live in faint horror of men, seemed unwilling to approve wholeheartedly of them. But I liked them. There was something about them, no matter how much they cussed and drank and gambled and chewed, no matter how undelectable they were. There was something about them that I instinctively liked. They weren't hip.
So notice that this part here is Scout's opinion, right? She's listening to all of these women and she says, "Wow, I have to become a part of this world," right? They're talking and they don't really understand exactly what's going on, except for Miss Maudie. And then she says, "That's why I kind of like the men. They might not have it all together, but they aren't." And then the next woman picks up the word hypocrite. So let's take a look at Mrs. Perkins' conversation.
"Hypocrites, Mrs. Perkins. Born hypocrites," Mrs. Merriweather was saying. "At least we don't have that sin on our shoulders down here. People up there set 'em free, but you don't see 'em setting at the table with them. At least we don't have the deceit to say to 'em, 'Yes, you're as good as we are, but stay away from us.' Down here we just say, 'You live your way and we'll live ours.' I think that woman, that Mrs. Roosevelt's lost her mind, just plain lost her mind, coming down to Birmingham and trying to sit with 'em. If I was the mayor of Birmingham, Well, neither of us was the mayor of Birmingham, but I wished I was the governor of Alabama for one day. I'd let Tom Robinson go so quick, the missionary society wouldn't have time to catch its breath. Calpurnia was telling Miss Rachel's cook the other day how bad Tom was taking things, and she didn't stop talking when I came into the kitchen. She said there wasn't a thing Atticus could do to make being shut up easier for him. That the last thing he said to Atticus before they took him down to the prison camp was, "Goodbye, Mr. Finch. There ain't nothing you can do now, so there ain't no use trying." Calpurnia said Atticus told her that the day they took Tom to prison, he just gave up hope. She said Atticus tried to explain things to him, and that he must do his best not to lose hope, because Atticus was doing his best to get him free. Miss Rachel's cook asked Calpurnia, why didn't Atticus just say, yes, you'll go free, and leave it at that? Seemed like that'd be a big comfort to Tom. Calpurnia said, because you ain't familiar with the law. First thing you learn when you're in a law and family is that there ain't any definite answers to anything. Mr. Finch couldn't say something so when he doesn't know for sure it's so. The front door slammed, and I heard Atticus's footsteps in the hall. Automatically, I wondered what time it was. Not nearly time for him to be home, and on missionary society days he usually stayed downtown till black dark.
So this indicates that there is something wrong if Atticus is coming home earlier than he normally does. So we need to kind of figure out exactly what's going on. So I want you to keep in mind that Tom has been brought to prison, and Calpurnia is relating to Scout that he looked as if he didn't have any hope left. Although we know that Atticus wants to appeal and hopefully be able to gain his freedom back. So let's take a look to see exactly what's wrong and why Atticus needs to come home earlier than he normally does.
He stopped in the doorway. His hat was in his hand, and his face was white. Excuse me, ladies, he said. Go right ahead with your meeting. Don't let me disturb you. Alexandra, could you come to the kitchen a minute? I want to borrow Calpurnia for a while. He didn't go through the dining room, but went down the back hallway and entered the kitchen from the rear door. Aunt Alexandra and I met him. The dining room door opened again, and Miss Maudie joined us. Calpurnia had half risen from her chair. Cal, Atticus said, I want you to go with me out to Helen Robinson's house. What's the matter? Aunt Alexandra asked, alarmed by the look on my father's face. Tom's dead.
So we need to figure out exactly why Tom is dead.
Aunt Alexandra put her hands to her mouth. They shot him, said Atticus. He was running. It was during their exercise period. They said he just broke into a blind, raving charge at the fence and started climbing over, right in front of them. Didn't they try to stop him? Didn't they give him any warning? Aunt Alexandra's voice shook. Oh, yes. The guards called to him to stop. They fired a few shots in the air, then to kill. They got him just as he went over the fence. They said if he'd had 2 good arms, he'd have made it. He was moving that fast. 17 bullet holes in him. They didn't have to shoot him that much. Cal, I want you to come out with me and help me tell Helen. Yes, sir, she murmured, fumbling at her apron. Miss Maudie went to Calpurnia and untied it. This is the last straw, Atticus, Aunt Alexandra said. Depends on how you look at it, he said. What was one Negro, more or less, among 200 of them? He wasn't Tom to them. He was an escaping prisoner. Atticus leaned against the refrigerator, pushed up his glasses, and rubbed his eyes. We had such a good chance, he said. I told him what I thought, but I couldn't in truth say that we had more than a good chance. I guess Tom was tired of white men's chances and preferred to take his own. Ready, Cal? Yes, sir, Mr. Finch. Then let's go. Aunt Alexandra sat down in Calpurnia's chair and put her hands to her face. She sat quite still. She was so quiet, I wondered if she would faint. I heard Miss Maudie breathing as if she had just climbed the steps, and in the dining room the ladies chattered happily. I thought Aunt Alexandra was crying, but when she took her hands away from her face, she was not. She looked weary. She spoke, and her voice was flat. I can't say I approve of everything he does, Maudie, but he's my brother, and I just want to know when this will ever end. Her voice rose. It tears him to pieces. He doesn't show it much, but it tears him to pieces. I've seen him win. What else do they want from him, Maudie? What else? What does who want, Alexandra? Miss Maudie asked. I mean this town. They're perfectly willing to let him do what they're too afraid to do themselves. It might lose them a nickel. They're perfectly willing to let him wreck his health doing what they're afraid to do. Be quiet, they'll hear you, said Miss Maudie. Have you ever thought of it this way, Alexandra? Whether Maycomb knows it or not, we're paying the highest tribute we can pay a man. We trust him to do right. It's that simple.
So here you can see how Miss Maudie is explaining to Alexandra why they have this level of trust with Atticus. She goes and she says that he's the one that they trust to do what's right. It's that simple. And Atticus knows this as well. That's why he's the one who's going to deliver the message to Tom Robinson's wife that he has been shot. So what I would like you to do is to finish reading this chapter, and then your assignment is to finish reading chapter 25 as well. I'm here if you have any questions. You can message me, or you can also send me an email. So let's continue on with the ending of this chapter.
Who? Aunt Alexandra never knew she was echoing her 12-year-old nephew. The handful of people in this town who say that fair play is not marked white only. The handful of people who say a fair trial is for everybody, not just us. The handful of people with enough humility to think, when they look at a Negro, there but for the Lord's kindness am I. Miss Maudie's old crispness was returning. The handful of people in this town with background. That's who they are. Had I been attentive, I would have had another scrap to add to Jim's definition of background, but I found myself shaking and couldn't stop. I had seen Enfield Prison Farm, and Atticus had pointed out the exercise yard to me. It was the size of a football field. Stop that shaking, commanded Miss Maudie, and I stopped. Get up, Alexandra. We've left 'em long enough. Aunt Alexandra rose and smoothed the various whalebone ridges along her hips. She took her handkerchief from her belt and wiped her nose. She patted her hair and said, Do I show it? Not a sign, said Miss Maudie. Are you together again, Jean Louise? Yes, ma'am. Then let's join the ladies, she said grimly. Their voices swelled when Miss Maudie opened the door to the dining room. Aunt Alexandra was ahead of me, and I saw her head go up as she went through the door. Oh, Mrs. Perkins, she said, you need some more coffee. Let me get it. Calpurnia's on an errand for a few minutes, Grace, said Miss Maudie. Let me pass you some of these dewberry tarts. D'you hear what that cousin of mine did the other day, the one who likes to go fishing? And so they went, down the row of laughing women, around the dining room, refilling coffee cups, dishing out goodies as though their only regret was the temporary domestic disaster of losing Calpurnia. The gentle hum began again. Yes, sir, Mrs. Perkins, that J. Grimes Everett is a martyred saint. He needed to get married, so they ran to the beauty parlor every Saturday afternoon. Soon as the sun goes down, he goes to bed with the chickens, a crate full of sick chickens. Fred says that's what started it all. Fred says, Aunt Alexandra looked across the room at me and smiled. She looked at a tray of cookies on the table and nodded at them. I carefully picked up the tray and watched myself walk to Mrs. Merriweather. With my very best company manners, I asked her if she would have some. After all, if Auntie could be a lady at a time like this, so could I.
So that brings us to the end of chapter 24. I know this video is a little lengthy, so if you don't want to stay, and listen to the entire video, you can read this chapter on your own. I did stop a few times just to kind of guide you in regards to the style that Harper Lee uses, especially in this chapter. There's a lot of interjection from Scout's perspective, right? She gives us almost what we'd hope is a word-for-word recount of the conversation that Aunt Alexandra has with her company, with the women. Through their dialogue, we can gain a better understanding of their perspective, their opinions, not only about Tom Robinson and Atticus, but about, in general, how society should work. And then Scout's interjections, when she tells us what she thinks about it, helps us to better understand Scout as well. Especially here at the end of the chapter, when once Atticus and Calpurnia leave, Aunt Alexandra puts on a front so that none of the women know what just happened and why Calpurnia had to be excused. And Scout, again, as she's growing and she's becoming, she's getting older, she realizes that she should do the same thing. So your job is going to be, again, to read chapter 25. You do have a few questions, and one of them is going to be on the style, similar to what we did in the beginning of the lesson, and then you also have a discussion post for today. If you have any questions or you need any help, please message me on Schoology, or you can also email me. I hope everyone is, again, staying well. I miss you guys, and I will see everyone on Thursday.